On the night of the 26th of August, 1883, a man stood at the edge of a black sea and listened to something he could not explain. The island beneath his feet was called Rodrigues, a small British-administered outpost in the Indian Ocean, several hundred miles east of Mauritius. What he heard came from the east, low and rolling, and it repeated through the night at irregular intervals. He described it in the only terms that made any sense, as coming from the eastward, like the distant roar of heavy guns. The conclusion he reached was entirely reasonable, and almost anyone in his position would have reached the same one. A ship somewhere out there was in trouble and was firing its cannon into the dark, hoping somebody would hear. He wrote it down carefully in the record, as officers on duty are trained to do, and then he continued his watch. There is one problem with his explanation, and it is a problem that would not become apparent for another 5 years. East of Rodrigues, there is nothing at all. Open water for thousands of miles, in every direction that sound could have come from. We will leave him there for now, holding his lantern, having written down something he believed he understood. Because on that same night, in places thousands of miles apart, other people were writing down almost exactly the same thing. In the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, roughly 1,300 miles from the source, observers recorded extraordinary sounds, as though guns were firing. In New Guinea and Western Australia, roughly 2,000 miles out, witnesses logged a series of loud reports resembling distant artillery. Perth heard it as well, at a distance of more than 3,000 kilometers from anything that could have made it. By the time every account was eventually gathered, the same sound had been heard at more than 50 separate locations around the world. Together, those locations span roughly 1/13 of the entire surface of the Earth. It remains to this day the furthest traveling audible sound in all of recorded human history. And here is the detail that makes all of it strange. Not one of those observers was in contact with any of the others. Each of them recorded a local curiosity, filed it, explained it to themselves in some ordinary way, and moved on with their lives. But something else was listening that day, in cities where not a single human being heard anything at all. By 1883, weather stations across the world were equipped with an instrument called a barograph, and it worked without anyone watching it. A clockwork drum turned slowly, wrapped in ruled paper, while a thin ink pen traced the pressure of the air onto the chart. It required no observer and no interpretation. It simply recorded continuously whatever passed through the atmosphere above it. 6 hours and 47 minutes after the explosion, a sharp spike appeared on the chart in Calcutta. At 8 hours, the same spike appeared in Mauritius in one direction, and in Melbourne and Sydney in the other. At 12 hours, it reached St Petersburg, and then Vienna, Rome, Paris, Berlin, and Munich in turn. By 18 hours, it had crossed the Atlantic and registered in New York, in Washington, and in Toronto. A single pulse of air had crossed the entire planet, drawn onto paper in cities where nobody had heard a thing. That alone would have been remarkable. It is not, however, the part that unsettled the people who eventually studied these charts, because roughly a day and a half later, in those same cities on fresh paper, the spike appeared again, and then again, and then again after that, at intervals of roughly 34 hours for 5 consecutive days. Around 50 cities recorded the repetition. Some instruments captured 4 passes, and others captured as many as 7. That 34-hour interval happens to be approximately how long a pressure wave takes to travel all the way around the world. which means those instruments had spent 5 days quietly recording something lapping the planet over and over, and nobody standing beside any single one of them could possibly have known. The source of all of it was a volcanic island in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra called Krakatoa. The defining explosion occurred at 10 in the morning on the 27th of August, 1883. 2/3 of the island collapsed into the sea, and the ocean rushed into the space where it had been and then blasted back out again. The waves that followed reached 30 meters and more and crossed the strait to the coasts of Java and Sumatra within minutes. Dutch colonial authorities recorded 36,417 deaths, and most researchers treat that number as a floor rather than a ceiling. Sailors 40 miles away suffered ruptured eardrums. Ash fell on ships 6,000 kilometers out. Faint traces of the disturbance in the sea were eventually detected as far away as the English Channel. And still, at the time, almost nobody could see what had actually happened, because the evidence was scattered across the world in fragments. Every observer held one piece, and not a single one of those pieces looked anything like a volcano. A sound like gunfire, a spike of ink on paper, a wave in a harbor on the far side of the world. The Royal Society formed a committee to gather it all together, collecting reports, ship's logs, and paper charts from across the globe. Their report was published in 1888, 5 full years after the event it described. Only in that volume, with every fragment finally laid alongside every other, did the shape of what had happened become visible for the first time. Which brings us back to a small island in the Indian Ocean and a man standing at the edge of the water with a lantern. On Rodrigues, 3,000 miles from a mountain that he had never heard of, he listened to the loudest sound in recorded human history. He decided it was probably a ship in trouble, wrote that down in the record, and finished his shift. His note sat in a file for 5 years before anyone understood what he had actually been hearing, and by then he had become one line of evidence in somebody else's report. If you had been standing on that shore, hearing guns roll in from an empty ocean, what would you have written in the book? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more journeys like this one.